as we make our way this summer through the book of Acts, Acts of the Apostles, here's a story you might have actually heard before. It comes from Acts 9, and it is the resurrection by Peter of a woman named Tabitha or Dorcas. Hear these words from Acts chapter 9. Now in Joppa there was a disciple whose name was Tabitha, which in Greek is Dorcas. She was devoted to good works and acts of charity. At that time she became ill and died. When they had washed her, they laid her in a room upstairs. Since Lydda was near Joppa, the disciples who heard that Peter was there sent 2 men to him with the request, "Please come to us without delay." So Peter got up and went with them, and when he arrived, they took him to the room upstairs. All the widows stood beside him, weeping and showing tunics and other clothing that Dorcas had made while she was with them. Peter put all of them outside and then knelt down and prayed. He turned to the body and said, "Tabitha, get up." Then she opened her eyes, and seeing Peter, she sat up. He gave her his hand and helped her up. Then calling the saints and widows, he showed her to be alive. This became known throughout Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. Meanwhile, he stayed in Joppa for some time with a certain Simon, a tanner. May God add understanding to the hearing of these words. And will you pray with me, please? Holy and gracious God, be within us and among us as we turn our hearts and our minds to you. Amen. This story, and many other stories like this, about bringing someone back to life, I have a hard time knowing what to do with these stories. Not just as a pastor trying to produce a sermon out of them, but as a human, as a person of faith, what do I do with a story like this? How do we take this seriously and faithfully? I can take this literally and say, this happened. Take my word for it. Take his word for it. But the point is just then that this happened and the sermon's over. Because it happened or it didn't, but it must have been important at least to say that it happened. And they probably say that it happened as a way of demonstrating that these once disciples of Jesus can now do what he used to do. That these apostles of a nascent religion had supernatural power. And what self-respecting first century religion doesn't have access to some supernatural power over death? A power that would cause many to believe, and then after which you have brought someone back to life from the dead, you would stay in Joppa for some time with a certain Simon, a tanner. It's one of the funniest endings to the story, presumably to rest and recover and get fitted for a new pair of sandals. Or you could take all this figuratively and say, well, this was a way of our spiritual ancestors talking about how we, through faith in God, have some participation in life beyond death. And that sounds more like me. I would quote someone like the New Testament scholar John Dominic Crossan, and I would say as he did that it is not as though our spiritual ancestors told literal stories and we are smart enough to take them figuratively. It is that our spiritual ancestors told figurative stories and we're dumb enough to take them literally. Which is cute in this incisive way. And then we can feel good that we're not like one of those silly Christians who take stories like this literally, but then the sermon's over and we still walk away going, well, we'll never really know. We could do all of this and still, I think, we'd be avoiding the heart of the struggle in this passage and the struggle in this story. As I see it, that it brings us face to face with is the relationship between faith and death. What is the relationship between faith and death? What is the unique claim that our faith has or that our God has regarding death? Does our faith mean on some level we don't have to die, we can avoid it. That death isn't real for us, or that it doesn't have to be the final word, or does a faith simply help us deal with death when it comes? There is a unique alchemy in bringing religion and death together. This is where the immovable object meets the irresistible force. In the end, what wins? And for many of us, what is religion if not an answer to our questions about death? Christianity has largely, at least in this time and place, Christianity has become largely obsessed with the question of death. Mostly asking the question, so what happens after? Where will you go when you die? The good place or the bad place? Smoking or non-smoking, sir? That joke doesn't hold up nearly as well as it used to. We've become, for some, a religion oriented around death, where the real question about life is about what happens when life ends. Thinking about this life is mostly about making sure we get in the right lane before our exit. And stories like this sometimes don't help. If we say, see, this is what real faith is about, not dying. We leverage these and say, see, we don't have to die. There's power over and beyond death. If only we, and that's the trouble, if only we what? Have enough faith? Have quick access to an apostle who's in the next town over? If only we're worth saving? There's something that makes these miracle stories, depending on where they hit us, almost offensive. We're already grieving, and this has a way of adding resentment to it. If all this is real, if so, why her? Why then? Why not us? Why not now? Was Tabitha, Dorcas just particularly worth saving? Was God just doing some special one-off to make a point and give the early church a boost? It's hard not to resent these stories on some level. So God was there. Great. Where was God for me? Or him? Or her? Or them? What about our death when it comes? I get that. It might be the most natural thing that a self-conscious living entity does, to think about not existing and then trying to make sure that doesn't happen because we really like existing. Humans have always obsessed over death. And our religion should have something to say about death because we should deal with all of life, and death is a part of life. And yet our faith is not about death. It's about living. Our faith can't be obsessed with death any more than we can live obsessed with dying. Let me skip to the end and skip to the point. You're welcome. And say, as best I can tell, I am a Christian not because I fear death. I do fear death because I still fear pain, mostly for those who love me. I fear their grief and loss. I don't want to die, but that's not why I'm a Christian. Death and what's beyond, if I know anything, is out of my hands. I am a Christian because I want to live well while I can. I am not religious because I think it will give me a chance to cheat death. I am religious because I believe it helps me be more alive. Maybe you've seen this clip. It's pretty famous at this point. Two people I never thought I'd quote. Well, maybe Stephen Colbert, but it's Stephen Colbert and Keanu Reeves. That part I didn't see coming. Stephen Colbert was once interviewing Keanu Reeves, and he asked him at the end of the interview, he said, "So what do you think happens when we die, Keanu Reeves?" And after a pause and a breath, he said, "I know that the ones who love us will miss us." He shook his hand after that one. I officiated a funeral yesterday. I have, by my rough count, officiated a couple hundred in my time. Funerals, memorial services, celebrations of life, services of committal, whatever we call them. And I can tell you what you already know, and maybe the one thing that we can say with certainty. The ones who love us will miss us. Tabitha, Dorcas, is the only woman ever referred to as a disciple, which says far more about those telling the story than it does about the contribution of women to Christianity. But here we have one of our first real glimpses into what this early Jesus movement was like before the patriarchal clamps came down generations later. And what this was far more gracefully open and faithfully courageous than many churches 2,000 years later are willing to be, but that's another sermon. We don't know much about Tabitha, Dorcas, but you could actually say that we know more about her than we know about most, especially women like her. We know she was devoted to good works and acts of charity. We know that at least some of that good work was making garments, cloaks, and tunics for a group of widows, and the same widows who washed her body when she died, later to rest upstairs and wept. It is for me the most poignant moment in this story when these widows show those clothes to Peter, as if to say, you see, here's proof that she lived and she was special. In the same way at our visitations and at our funerals, we make our slideshow videos and display tables full of beloved artifacts, as we should. And those who loved Tabitha, Dorcas, could not help but show Peter the work of her life. And see what she did? See who she was? See what she meant? What a gift to still have someone using what you have made to leave a hole in someone's life. It's an excruciating gift to be mourned. The ones who loved her missed her. And as I feel at the heart of this story is not, if we do it right, maybe we don't really have to die either. The heart of this story is a challenge to live well. Tabitha, Dorcas, if you believe it, she received what might be the greatest gift possible. More of this life that we so often take for granted. And we can be happy for her, and the takeaway yet is still for us, not how do we cheat death too. It's how do we live so well. How will someone someday tell our story? What will our legacy be? What will they bring out to show others and say, see what he did? See who she was? See what they meant? Now is the time to decide to spend our lives on what matters most. Live a life that will be missed. Stories like this bring us face to face with the question of death, and we find out we're really facing questions of life. And so, to borrow Peter's words to Tabitha, Dorcas, get up. Get up and live. Take your life into your own hands, carpe diem and all that, because there is no later. Life is now. And whether you believe yourself to be close to the end of your life, or if you still get to live most of the time forgetting that death is even a thing, get up and live like it matters. Because it does. We don't have to wait to die to come back to life. Some years ago, I remember our high school youth group made a visit over to Village Green, which is an assisted living facility. I hope I'm pointing in the right direction. I think I am. I'm bad at that. We had an intergenerational conversation between our youth and some of the residents there. We talked about all kinds of things. It was fantastic. It was great because the teenagers hadn't developed their filters yet and the residents had lost theirs, which makes for great conversation. But I remember that at the end of an hour and a half of back and forth, one of the last questions from our youth, almost offhand as we were leaving, was something along the lines of, so how do you usually spend your time? And without a beat, one of our now late members, her name was Lorraine Carnatz, as she was being wheeled out the door, she started singing, "Staying alive, staying alive." Which I will always remember as really good advice. Thanks be to God. Amen.